Dr. Phil is a figure that really needs no introductions. I mean, I'm sure we've all had our fair share of laughing to some of the people that come to his show. Sometimes he tries to talk some sense into them, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he has serious discussions, sometimes he doesn't. But in a recent episode of his show, he said this.
If anyone here wants to fact check me instead of speak over me, you can go to the scientific literature and query what the definition is of the beginning of life, and you will find that there are different definitions.
And if you know anything about me, you know I'm dead set on taking that challenge. But before we get into the meat and vegetables of it all, let's first talk about a little backstory. Lila Rose, one of the most prominent pro-life activists, was on Dr. Phil's show where they discussed abortion.
I know that you probably have feelings about this going into it. I'm sure you do, those of you at home and those of you here. I just ask everyone to really have an open mind and open heart about this. And I always encourage people to approach these things, even though you have some feelings about it, with some authentic curiosity. If you can really try and understand why the other side feels the way they do, at the same time you try to get them to understand the way you feel the way you do, then there's a chance to have some empathy and understanding for each other's side instead of demonizing each side.
This is one of Dr. Phil's strengths, and I agree, trying to empathize with the other side is one of the most important things you can do if you're trying to get to the truth. People don't believe the things that they believe for no reason, so trying to understand why the other side believes something is a great way to see the possible faults in your own logic. Speaking for pro-lifers here, and if you are pro-choice, this might help you understand where we come from. We feel very strongly about abortion because we genuinely believe that abortion is ending a human life. Around 900,000 abortions are being performed just in the US per year, with 450,000 per year and 9 million per year being performed in Russia and China respectively. China reported a total of 336 million abortions. If you believed that was 336 million dead human beings in China and 62 million dead human beings in the US, a genocide against the most vulnerable group of people, ones that cannot even speak for themselves, wouldn't you feel passionately about it too? You think that you're dealing with your own body, so the fact that pro-lifers want to ban abortion might seem like they're trying to control you. In reality, they truly believe that you are ending a life. If you could stop the killing of someone innocent, wouldn't you try to? Now, I understand the pro-choice side too, at least I think I do. If you are pro-choice and if I misunderstand what you stand for, please feel free to point it out in the comments. I would love to hear from you. You believe that the baby is not living and that it is your own body, and so you have a right to do whatever you want with it, including removing it. You believe that it is using up your bodily resources without your consent, and that even if it is alive, your right to bodily autonomy surpasses that of the child. So, in reality, the fundamental disagreement between the pro-life and the pro-choice side is in that of whether or not the baby is a living human being, whether or not it should legally be treated as such, and whether or not it should be protected under the law. If you believe that the fetus is nothing but a clump of cells, and that life begins at an arbitrary point in the womb or outside of it, then the pro-choice position makes sense. However, if you believe that life begins at conception and that we should protect that life, then the pro-life position is the rational one. With the understanding of which questions here matter the most, let's get on with the video.
My husband and I, we had a miscarriage about 2 years ago. They were some of the darkest days of my life. And they were dark days because it was our child. You know, we knew this was a baby. And I think that's the fundamental point here, is that we're talking about a baby. We're talking about a human life. And the pro-life position is that all humans have human rights. And the first right is life, to not be killed.
I believe that this is a great point, and this is why the bodily autonomy argument falls apart if the baby in the womb is indeed alive. Because for you to have any other quote-unquote human rights, as you Westerners like to call them, you first need the right to life. A murderer on death row does not and cannot have any other rights, for he has lost even the most basic right, and that is the right to life.
Coming up, should the government dictate what a woman can do with her body? That's a big question. And when does life begin?
I wish Lila responded to this, because this is a very deliberately framed question. Should the government dictate what a woman can do with her own body? The problem with this question is that it assumes that the baby is the body of his mother. That is a pro-choice position. A pro-lifer would never say that the baby is the woman's body. A pro-lifer would say that the baby is a body of its own. Dr. Phil framed the question in such a way that it seems like forbidding abortion is akin to slavery. Certainly some pro-choicers think that, as we will see in a moment, but it is not a neutral statement.
Ohio is one of at least 9 states which make no exceptions for rape or incest. In Indiana, abortions are still legal up to 22 weeks.
Something that kind of strikes me as odd is how there being no exceptions for rape or incest is seen as shocking. But if you really understood the pro-life position or the pro-life side of the story, it would seem completely logical. As I have stated before, the pro-life point of view is that the life of the unborn should be protected. Rape or incest does not change that. In other words, who my father is should not determine whether or not I'm given a chance to live. If my father is a rapist, does that mean that I deserve to live any less than a child whose father is a good man? I don't think so. We cannot choose our parents. The argument from the pro-choice side is usually how carrying a rapist child is incredibly traumatic for the mother, which I don't doubt in the slightest. However, that does not mean that the child is any less worthy of life, and this goes for any circumstances he might have been conceived in. As Lila put it here, the baby is not to blame.
A woman to have the child? What kind of trauma is that
trauma
you're
is from the
inducing on
rape.
somebody?
The trauma is from the rape. The child's an innocent party there.
I see a lot of my audience wiggling in their chairs. If you've got something to say, raise your hand.
Great, I do. I have lots to say, actually. A ton to say, actually.
Okay.
I would say, though, in this particular case with Nancy, who I feel absolutely terrible for, Lila, I really feel like your views, you just want to legislate evil. That's really how it feels when I hear you speak, especially when you're talking about a 10-year-old girl who was raped. I'm sorry. And to hear you say that, they should just have it anyway is disgusting. I really think you're a traitor to your own, and I will never be able to agree with you. There's nothing you could justify to say that she should have to carry it to bury it. There is nothing you could possibly say to justify that level of lack of empathy. And that's the problem I feel like in this country at the moment. We were founded on the lack of empathy, and we've just kept up with that tradition. If you have no empathy.
Of course, the audience clapped. I believe that even if you are pro-choice, you can see that the argument this woman is making is purely based on emotion. She accuses Lila of having no empathy for the girl who was brutalized, while having absolutely no empathy for the innocent child conceived in the process. As I stated earlier, a child should not be any less deserving of life than other children if the child's father was a terrible human being. Nobody said the girl has to raise the baby, she simply shouldn't be allowed to kill it. There are thousands of couples with fertility issues who would love to adopt a baby. The girl does not even have to keep it after birth.
No empathy.
Abortion is devastating to women's mental health. No one talks about that. The year after a woman has an abortion,
it's really like
the year after a woman
to have the child. What kind of trauma is
the
that
trauma
you're
is from the
inducing on
rape.
somebody?
The trauma is from the rape. The child's an innocent party.
I agree. Abortion is devastating for women since most of them understand that deep down they killed their child. Perhaps Lila didn't have the references on hand, but this is backed up by multiple studies, including this study by Professor David Ferguson of the Christchurch School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Quote, 41% of women had become pregnant on at least one occasion prior to age 25, with 14.6% having an abortion. Those having an abortion had elevated rates of subsequent mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, suicidal behaviors, and substance abuse disorders. This association persisted after adjustment for confounding factors. Conclusion? The finding suggests that abortion in young women may be associated with increased risk of mental health problems.
The child's an innocent party there.
The child isn't born yet. It's not there.
We should not take out generational sin on a child to say there's generational sin and that dad was an abuser, so the child should be killed. That's not fair to the child.
We're talking about rights. And he just said, a right has been taken away from us. And what is next?
I want to address that because our fundamental human right that we all share in this room is life. It's the first human right. Laws are meant to protect the weak. In a society, who's the weakest? Who's the weakest in the society? A child.
The poor.
They don't have a voice.
Of course, Lila is right here, but again, we can see the fundamental disconnect between the two sides. Lila is claiming that the child's right to life comes before the mother's right to an abortion because life is the most fundamental human right. This woman, of course, does not seem to get that because, to her, the child is not alive, it doesn't exist. This is why it is so important to answer the question of when life begins.
Whether you live 10 minutes or 10 years or 100 years, you're a human life and you have the right to not be killed.
I would like to add here that every human should have the right to life unless he gives it up. And giving up the right to life would mean committing crimes that earn you a death sentence.
Abortion is the intentional destruction of an innocent human life.
Doesn't a woman
we can
have
do
a
better
right
than
to
that.
choose that for herself?
A right to choose what? A right to choose what?
Doesn't a woman have
What
a
does an
right
abortion
to
do?
choose what happens to her body?
But what's in her body? There's another
you
life
know,
we're talking about. Let's acknowledge the
there's
science.
and I would defer
Let's acknowledge
to
the
Christian and the
When
experts,
do you
but I
think
will
human
say
life
this.
begins?
Again, we can see the disconnect here. The two sides simply see it in a completely opposite way. Lila wants to protect the life of the child, whereas the pro-choicers don't even believe that there is a life in the first place. If we do not agree on this simple point of when life begins, no discussion will be productive.
You can't just be pro-fetus and not pro-life.
Right.
You're
Because
both.
a lot of
We're
times what we
pro
see...
human beings.
No,
We're
but
pro human beings. And
after
women
a
deserve
lot
better
of
than
these
abortion.
children are born, all
deserve
those
better.
legislators who vote for pro-life when the baby's inside the woman, then do nothing to vote to help them with health care, after-school care, daycare, all these things, especially in marginalized communities.
And here we have my favorite, you can't be pro-fetus and not pro-life, Strawman. This is an addition to the conversation to try to run away from the point being made by Lila, but since we are here, let's address it anyways. Pro-choicers like to claim that pro-lifers don't care about children as soon as they are outside of the womb, which is obviously not true. Pro-lifers have established crisis pregnancy centers around the United States simply for the purpose of protecting and sharing resources with mothers both before and after birth, and helping them in any way they can, including financially. But what is the left's response to this? Quote, in June alone, there were more than 30 attacks on pro-life pregnancy centers. Here are just a few. Several pregnancy centers in Michigan were attacked in a span of just 3 days. One of the centers had multiple windows broken and graffiti of the phrase, if abortion isn't safe, neither are you. A pregnancy center in Virginia was vandalized with graffiti that included the phrase, if abortion isn't safe, you ain't safe, along with an anarchist symbol. Multiple windows and the front door were also broken. This Christian pro-life pregnancy center in Colorado is recovering from heavy fire and smoke damage after being set on fire by pro-abortion activists. The buildings also suffered from broken windows and graffiti. A pregnancy center in Minnesota had windows broken and was vandalized with the graffiti of pro-abortion message, abortion is liberation. So, which side is it that doesn't support mothers after they give birth again? Of course, if you are focusing on one issue, your concern is not invalid if you don't also exclusively focus on another issue. If you care deeply about the endangered Javan rhinos, your concern is not automatically invalidated if you don't campaign as passionately about the protection of endangered mountain gorillas. Just like if you are a heart surgeon, your work is not invalid just because you aren't a neurologist. According to the leftist logic here, if you are a cardiologist, you don't really care about people, do you? If you did, you would operate on people with brain tumors. Of course, when we put it like that, then we can all understand that not every person can do everything, and so if a pro-lifer is campaigning against abortion and he doesn't actively campaign for the adoption of orphans, even though many pro-lifers do, this does not make his concern and his mission invalid.
Yes, sir, in the back, right here. Go ahead, sir.
Hi. What is troubling me is the idea of government-mandated pregnancy.
Can I respond to that?
That's in the end, that's what's happening.
No one is forcing anyone to get pregnant.
Motherhood is
No one is
slavery.
forcing everyone.
No.
Can I respond to that?
And this gem also. Government-mandated pregnancy and forced motherhood. First of all, nobody's forcing you to be a mother. If you conceive a child, you are a mother. Doesn't matter if you kill it, or if you raise it, or if you give it up for adoption. You are still a mother. I assume that by forced motherhood, she actually means being forced to take care of it and raise a child. And of course, again, this is not the case. You can always give up the child for adoption, and you will 99% of the time be able to find a couple that wants to adopt the baby before you even give birth. Second of all, if you engage in sexual activity, you are aware that there is a possibility of pregnancy because the only contraception which is 100% effective is abstinence. You are not 4 years old, you understand that sexual activity leads to pregnancy, you know where babies come from, and it is the mechanism by which our species survives. When you consent to sex, you know that it might result in pregnancy.
Looking to create
let me
a
finish.
single cell embryo, and then you know you have a new human life. So it is a scientific fact.
Well, actually, it's not.
When do you say human life begins then?
It doesn't matter what I think. I don't care what I think. What I'm saying is the scientific community does not have a consensus about when life begins.
It's simply inaccurate. It's simply inaccurate.
You can go to the scientific literature and query what the definition is of the beginning of life, and you will find that there are different definitions.
Alright, Dr. Phil, let's do it. Challenge accepted. According to the USCCB, at the moment the sperm cell of the human male meets the ovum of the female and the union results in a fertilized ovum or a zygote, a new life has begun. Human development begins after the union of male and female gametes or germ cells during a process known as fertilization or conception. According to the Princeton University, who have compiled some references as to when human life begins, of course every study and article I cite you will find in the description down below, quotes, development of the embryo begins at stage 1 when a sperm fertilizes an oocyte and together they form a zygote. Embryo, an organism in the earliest stage of human development in a man from time of conception to the end of the second month in the uterus. Almost all higher animals start their lives from a single cell, the fertilized ovum or a zygote. The time of fertilization represents the starting point in the life history or ontogeny of the individual. And here is another one of Princeton's articles. Quote, to accurately see why a sperm or an oocyte are considered as only possessing human life and not as living human beings themselves, one needs to look at the basic scientific facts involved in the processes of gametogenesis and fertilization. It may help to keep in mind that the products of gametogenesis and fertilization are very different. The products of gametogenesis are mature sex gametes with only 23 instead of 46 chromosomes. The product of fertilization is a living human being with 46 chromosomes. Gametogenesis refers to the maturation of germ cells resulting in gametes. Fertilization refers to the initiation of a new human being. And, quote, please note that the scientific facts presented here are not simply a matter of my own opinion. They are direct quotes and references from some of the most highly respected human embryology textbooks and represent the consensus of human embryologists internationally. And according to the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is a pro-life group, quote, based on these criteria, the joining or fusion of sperm and egg clearly produces a new cell type, the zygote or one-celled embryo. Cell fusion is a well-studied and very rapid event occurring in less than a second. Because the zygote arises from the fusion of two different cells, it contains all the components of both sperm and egg, and therefore this new cell has a unique molecular composition from either gamete. Thus, the zygote that comes into existence at the moment of sperm-egg fusion meets the first scientific criterion for being a new cell type. Its molecular makeup is clearly different from that of the cell that gave rise to it. Human embryos from one cell or zygote stage forward uniquely integrated organismal behavior that is unlike the behavior of mere human cells. The zygote produces increasingly complex tissues, structures, and organs that work together in a coordinated way. Importantly, the cells, tissues, and organs produced during development do not somehow generate the embryo. They are produced by the embryo as it directs its own development to more mature stages of human life. This organized, coordinated behavior of the embryo is the defining characteristics of a human organism. The conclusion that human life begins at the sperm-egg fusion is uncontested, objective, based on the universally accepted scientific method of distinguishing different cell types from each other, and on ample scientific evidence from thousands of independent peer-reviewed publications. Now, the study that Lila was referring to earlier when she said this,
There is, Dr. Phil. 96%
No, actually,
of
there's
scientists
not.
say that life begins at fertilization.
was a study done by Stephen Andrew Jacobs of the University of Chicago, and he found that, quote, biologists from 1,058 academic institutions around the world assessed survey items on when a human's life begins, and overall, 96%, or 5,337 out of 5,577, affirmed the fertilization view. So yes, Dr. Phil, there is a consensus, a clear consensus. But even if there wasn't, wouldn't it make it more sense for you to be pro-life if there is no consensus? You claiming that means that when you think of a child who is about to be aborted, you think, well, I'm not sure exactly when I think it's a living human, which means this may or may not be a child, but let's take our chances and abort it anyways. We might have killed it, but I guess we'll never know. What gets even more interesting is that Dr. Phil seems to have taken all of his information from a single article that pops up when you Google the question. All of the points that he makes throughout the episode can be traced back to this article. Now, I wasn't the one to discover this, it was the YouTuber What Do You Meme, whose video and channel will be linked in the description for you to check out. With that being said, it seems pretty clear to me that Dr. Phil went on to debate this issue without too much research and by mostly repeating the points already made very frequently by the media at large. Lila did amazingly. She stood her ground even though she was outnumbered on the panel, with both the audience and the host going against her. To Dr. Phil's credit, he does invite conservatives on his show to debate and present their points even though they tend to be outnumbered, which is much more than other mainstream media tends to do. The likes of Lila Rose and Matt Walsh appearing on the Dr. Phil show will definitely benefit many individuals who might have never questioned the mainstream narrative before. And with that being said, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and may God bless you all.
My mother told me someday I will buy a galley with good oars, sail to distant shores, stand up on the prow